Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for watching. My name is Desiree Ohrbeck, and I'm a former Danish lecturer at the Scandinavian Studies Department at the University of Washington. Today I have a very special guest, Lykke Leonardsen. She's a program director for resilient and sustainable city solutions at the city of Copenhagen. Leonardsen has worked with urban development for the past 25 years. She's not only working to change her own city, she's also helping to change other cities. Lykke's focus is on the livable city, a city that always is looking for opportunities to improve life for its citizens. Welcome, Lykke.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Of course. Is there anything you would like to add to this introduction?
No, I think it's fine, at least for now. I can come with more details as we go along.
Absolutely. And chime in whenever you want to add something or correct me on something, and then we'll just take it from there. This interview is tying in with the book club, National Danish Book Club. And in this month, they're reading Tove Ditlevsen's Copenhagen Trilogy. The book club is hosted by Madison and is funded by donors such as ScanDesign Foundation and Scandinavian Studies Department of University of Washington. This month, as I said, the book focus will be on Tove Ditlevsen's Copenhagen Trilogy. And with Tove Ditlevsen's descriptions of Copenhagen and Vesterbro in particular, I thought it would be interesting to look at how Copenhagen has changed and overall how we look at sustainable cities today. And I can't think of anyone better to help us get smarter on this topic than Lykke Leonardsen. So Lykke, would you paint us a picture of what Copenhagen looked like in Tove Ditlevsen's time?
Yes, I moved to Copenhagen around 1980. I come from sort of the suburbs, the northern suburbs of Copenhagen. And at that time, Copenhagen was very different from what it is today. Actually, I moved to Vesterbro and also for a period of time lived just around the corner from where Tove Ditlevsen lived. So I know her neighborhood quite well. But it was a city that was declining in population. It was a city that was worn down. There were lots of buildings with unsanitary installations. You would say a lot of flats had their lavatories at the back stair of the building, so they didn't have a toilet inside. They didn't have a bath. And actually, the improvement of having a toilet on your back stair was an improvement to having it down in the backyard, which was what it was before. So, and also at the time of Tove Ditlevsen's life. So it was definitely something that is very different from what we're looking at. If you look also at sort of the socioeconomic situation of the population, it was a very, very poor population compared to what it is today. There were lots of students like me, and it was easy for us to find affordable housing. But it was also a city where the people with resources, with money, they left. In the area of Vesterbro, one of the local schools closed in the early 90s because there were only 2 children left to start in the first grade that year. So that sort of tells you that families with kids, they were leaving. There were lots of problems with drugs in Vesterbro also. So it was a city that was in many ways, it wasn't as bad as if you look at Detroit or New York in the 70s, but it has some of the same things, a little bit of that same despair. And when we move up in the early 90s, the city was actually bankrupt.
Wow, I didn't know that. And what you say resonates a lot. I'm born in Nørrebro, and we we did not have an outhouse, like you say, but we shared our like it was only like a little powder room, I guess you couldn't even call it that. And we shared it with a neighboring condo, and no bath either. So was this what prompted Copenhagen, like the authorities, to look at how can we improve the city, or what prompted it?
I think there were two things. First of all, in the 70s and 80s, there was and early 90s, there was a huge focus on basically getting safe housing with modern sanitary installations. So that was sort of the wave of what we call urban renewal. But there was a need also to look at how can we develop the city in a way that will also be attractive to families, so that we can basically, it was about raising the tax base of the city. That was the motivation, because it was really driven by the economic situation. But in doing that, sort of the first attempts of making housing that was attractive sort of started the first wave of livability. Nobody called it livability in those days, but it certainly did. The other, I mean, there were two other things that had a huge impact on the development of the issue of livability. One was bicycling. The fact, I mean, Copenhagen in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, you had enormous amounts of bikes, very few cars. But then in the 60s, cars took over, and sort of bikes were pushed out much more. But in the 70s and 80s, you started having demonstrations to get bike safety back up in the city, and having more bike lanes and so on. That was one thing, and that was built on in the coming decades. So now we are one of the best cities in the world to bike in, which has a huge impact on the livability. The other thing was actually a decision in the early 90s, even at a situation where the city was very close to bankruptcy, was to say, can we make it possible to go swimming in the harbor again? And at that time, when the proposals were made, I wasn't working at the city. Everybody thought it was like, okay, this is crazy. This is absolutely absurd. Why should, I mean, we had combined sewer overflows into the harbor every other day. We had polluting industry along the harbor, but they were closing down. And so the work on actually closing off all the combined sewer overflow started. And 10 years later, in 2002, it was actually possible to go swimming in the middle of the city in the harbor. And that sort of changed also the view of the city, of the harbor. And there was, together with the housing development, together with the building of bike infrastructure with bridges also crossing the harbor now, has sort of created that sort of combination of things that is what I call the livable city, because it addresses all aspects of urban life. It's not just about being safe. It's not just about having a good place to live, but it's also about being able to commute easily by bike to work. It's about to be able to go swimming in the harbor. Some of us are crazy enough to do it all year round. I'm one of them.
Yeah, well, it's pretty amazing, and I had some friends going to Copenhagen, and they were amazed, and that was one of the experiences that they were like, we'll never forget this, like taking a swim in the harbor. So I want to this is all very positive, and so I want to maybe turn it a little bit towards what can be learned from some of the mistakes, because so my family was one of the first who moved to Urbanplanen, and my grandmother called up Urban Hansen, the mayor at that time. And this project was supposed to be incorporated into what you just said, like envisioning a livable city where everything takes place within that little sub-community in the city, right? Like the post office and the grocery store. But that project, even though it was like pitched as a new living environment with, my grandmother always said, like big room, like bedrooms with lights coming in, as opposed to what it used to be like, what you just painted in Vesterbro, those tiny little apartments. So what did the politicians envision, and when it didn't succeed, because urban planning cannot be called a success, I think.
No.
Like what happened there?
Well, I think there was I think there were two things and urban plan is sort of a result of the 60s and early 70s urban planning, where there was a huge focus on, as I said, the unsanitary living conditions. So, and a lot of the politicians, they had grown up in the kind of small apartments that you describe, with an outhouse or a shared bathroom at the back of the stairs or something like that. And for them, the idea of creating this new type of planning, also a little bit based on sort of Le Corbusier's ideas of how to plan the ideal city, and I don't think they understood the qualities of the how to create an attractive urban space. I mean, in the States, you have this great urban leader, Jane Jacobs, who wrote about New York and who was fighting a lot with the big planner there from Moses. I can't remember his last name, sorry. but he was sort of at a time also, let's build big roads, let's do all the projects that you know from New York, that sort of the red blocks and so on, that might have a better quality of living than the buildings that were torn down, but you forgot the environment around it. You forgot to make them attractive. You forgot to connect them to the rest of the city. And all of us, you forgot to have suitable public transport and so on. So all of a sudden you had created these urban deserts where you can live in your apartment, and that's pretty much it. I mean, I know that, I mean, I come a lot in urban plan, or Remiseparken, as it's called now.
Oh, what is it called now? Sorry.
Remiseparken.
Oh, okay.
That was sort of a way of sort of getting off the bad connotations of the old name.
Yeah.
And a lot has been done, and I think it's much better now. But if you're looking at, they were supposed to have this little small shopping center in the middle, and it's there. I think there's one grocer and a few kiosks and something like that, and a place where you can go have a beer bar or something like that. That's pretty much it. So and that was also because at the same time you had the upcoming of shopping centers, larger shopping centers, and people would rather go there. And so all the local shops, mom and dad shops at the corners, they disappeared. They also disappeared in the 70s at Vesterbro or early 80s. When I moved to Vesterbro in the early 80s, there were lots of these small shops, and then a lot of them closed, and there was a long period where you would have empty shops or strange things going on. And now it's all like cafes and smart hipster shops in the area. So you have this transformation. For Copenhagen, I think one of the big changes was also the alliance with the famous Gale architects, who did a lot of studies on and had a much stronger focus of what goes on between the buildings. I think that's the key of the livability is not just the buildings themselves, but it's also what goes on in between the building. How do you create a city where it is attractive to walk, where there's actually something going on? And to be quite honest, it's not with straight line streets, it's actually with having curves, it's having that surprise of walking around a corner, and also having people using the streets for cafes or for shops and so on. So there's activity on the streets.
I think it's such an interesting concept to And I think I remember he also always took notes, like how do people actually move about from building to building, right?
Yeah.
And it's such an interesting concept to think about the open space as sort of part of the buildings, or at least the life that people live, and that is usable as well.
Yeah. And I think those were the things that were not considered when you made these areas. You had this vision, but you didn't have the understanding. And I don't want to blame them, because I think they did want to do something good. But it might have been, looking in hindsight, and it's always easy to be smart in hindsight.
Yeah.
It might have been better to actually see how much of the new buildings could you integrate in the old areas and so on, to have a better interaction. And it's, I think, in the new housing planning that is going on in Copenhagen, they are really trying to do that. I'm not saying they are always succeeding, because I still think that sometimes money wins over ambitions.
Yeah. Well,
that's all.
Okay, that's a great segue, because I wanted to ask you, and I have a few bullet points, and you can touch on, whichever you want. So when Copenhagen goes about developing the city and also into open land and use also existing parts of the city, how do they do like goal settings and data collection and analysis and forecasting and think about design, and how do they think strategically about this? Like it's such a huge amount of things to take into consideration.
Yeah,
How do they also, sorry, but how do they include the like public consultation to bring in what average people think they need?
We have we have two main planning tools, and the ones where all the things that you are mentioning are dealt with is actually in what we call the strategic municipal plan that's made every 4 years. It's a legislation in Denmark that all municipalities have to make such a plan. And this is where you sort of, you set you try to take on the classes that can allow you to look into the future. How is the population going to develop? What ages are we looking at? I mean, what are we looking at for needs of schools and kindergartens and all of the daycare and so on? What are the threats from climate change and so on? How do we need to take all of this into consideration in the planning? And it sort of also looks at where are areas where we can develop, and in which order can they be developed in order to be able to actually manage the development. So it's not like anybody can come and say, okay, we want to develop this. No, that it actually has to be able to follow, because the idea of making sure that there's sufficient infrastructure, and that we are not overdeveloping at any time is really crucial in that process. So it is, all of that is in that. Once you then start to, okay, you have the overall plan, you know this area is going to be developed, then you have a process with developing a plan for that specific areas. And in both planning systems, you have public consultation. It is, and very often then when you also do, one thing is doing like a development of an area where you make this local plan, a master plan on how to do it, what kind of buildings, how high are they going to be, and so on and so forth, demands on their energy efficiency and all kinds of things you can put into that. Then there's also projects where we are developing existing infrastructure, parks, and so on. And for most of these, there will be a public consultation period, very often with a working group consisting of local stakeholders, citizens, and maybe also some representatives of local businesses and so on, who can interact with the city planners in the process of saying, what can we do? I mean, what are the local wishes to this? I mean, do we want a skate park, or do we want a quiet place to sit and drink coffee? You cannot please everybody all the time, but that's the idea of having this public consultation.
It's very interesting. I mean, it will shape the identity of a whole neighborhood, right? Whatever you choose to put in.
Exactly. And of course, there's also there are lots of discussions. We also have so-called NIMBYs here, not in my backyard people. For instance, I mean, the harbor has been such a big success that there's a lot of activity going on the waterfront, especially in the summer. Not everybody are quiet, and some especially young kids like to party quite a lot. And so in some of the new housing developments, they do not want, normally we build like a wooden bridge along the quay so that people can get closer to the water. They do not want one like that because they're afraid of the things that it will attract. So we have that. I mean, it's not like everything is just perfect and everybody agrees all the time. There's lots of discussions because Copenhageners are not alike.
No, yeah, they're very diverse city. But it's also interesting, though, that you touch on, as far as I can hear, that spaces are given to the population, but the population then also has maybe to be socialized into learning how to go about being in that space in an appropriate way that makes the city, everyone in the city thrive.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
And that's an ongoing discussion. And to go back to where we started at Tove Ditlevsen, in those days you had the front house and a back house, and there was a small courtyard in between. And in all of these, there were a little board with all regulations that you cannot, in those days, you took your carpets down and were sort of whacking them to get off the dust because you didn't have a vacuum cleaner. And you were not allowed to do that after 8 and kids were not allowed to be there after a certain hour. And they were not allowed to play ball, and they were not allowed to do this and this and that. And those kind of regulations, also where I grew up, I mean, we had to get inside at 8 in the evening because I lived in a social housing area and we had to obey the common rules. And those were, in those days, I mean, it was done on a very local level. Now it becomes difficult because we are using the urban space in a very different way. And it became especially apparent during COVID, because a lot of people, the only place you could meet, because bars, restaurants, nightclubs, and so on were closed, so you could meet outside. And that's where you could meet your friends and that kind of interaction. And it goes both ways for people to accept you're living in the middle of a city. There are other people there, and they don't all have the same rhythm of their day as you do. On the other hand, and the other thing, you have to respect that you are in an area where people are also living. I live on the waterfront in Copenhagen, and there it's a spot where it's very popular to stop on the way home at night if you have been to a party and take a little dip. And if you have had too much to drink, people are not always very quiet. And there are neighbors here who get really annoyed because people are making noise. They're not having a party, they're just screaming and shouting because they're swimming, and then they go away. But it's still something that can create a conflict. How do you actually do that? We haven't found the magic ingredient to make that happen. It's an ongoing process of how to make that happen. I think we need to have a much more dialogue, and that's also what the city is doing. Rather than having police, there are police, of course, also present, but also having like we have some harbor hosts who sail up and down the harbor and tell people if they're swimming in places where it's not very smart to swim, but they do it in a way. They don't go out, say you will get a fine, but they sort of advise people not to do what they're doing. So hopefully, for keeping it positive.
Yeah, I'm going to pivot a little bit from the question I was going to ask you, because I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Like, do you feel like the change in people's behavior during COVID are long-term? And if so, like, do they stray from the anticipated behavior when when all these different spaces were created? Do you see what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
what you anticipated, is that
Well, I
is the
think
way people use it different now because of COVID? And will it be like that for the foreseeable future?
It's a very, very good question. We have talked a lot about if there is a young generation who have sort of have been lost in the educational process.
Yeah.
In all of this on socializing. I definitely think that in some places we have underestimated how popular these places would be.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, there are some new developments in the North Harbor where they have created swimming facilities, and it's completely, I mean, there's swarms of people there in the summer, and then you have housing right next to it, and people are sitting on their small terraces and balconies and having that outside. And it calls for some dialogue on how to actually manage that.
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting to see if it has long-term effects. Last summer, I mean in 21, there were lots of problems. This summer, apparently, we haven't had the same amount of problems. So
Okay.
let's hope that people are slowly learning. Let's hope that some of the things that both they're doing locally and what the city is doing can help in that process.
It will be interesting. I have followed the debate, and I did see 2 summers ago that people were really up in arms about the behavior on the waterfront, like you say.
Yeah.
And you know, it's a big city, and it's a diverse city, and everyone has to be there, and it's a learning curve for, I guess, everyone. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. And there are lots of people who, especially sort of older couples where the kids have left home, they're moving into the city, and they come from the suburbs where it's been much more quiet. And all of a sudden they cannot accept the fact that they think it's wonderful that there's a cafe downstairs, but they can't understand why the cafe doesn't close when they leave it to go up into their own apartment. I'm exaggerating, but there is that kind of thing. I mean, we had an example of a couple who bought an apartment right above one of the oldest bars in Copenhagen, which is right across from the central station. And when they moved in, they started complaining. I mean, what were they thinking? That bar had been there for 150 years. So, yeah.
It's a prickly topic. I mean, I completely get it. On the other hand, I would like my bike not to be peed on when I have to use it in the next morning. And, you know, there's so many things, but it's going to be interesting how this space, and when you live in a city, you live in a city. It is what it is, right? Yeah. I completely I hear what you're saying.
And actually, if you go back again to Tove Ditlevsen, at that time, they also had, I mean, all kids' life were on the streets, as you can read also in the books, because they had so small apartments and had large families. If you have an apartment with just 2 rooms, a bedroom and a living room, and you are a family of 2 grown-ups and 4 or 5 kids, you cannot make play dates with your school friends. You cannot do that.
It's interesting, because she actually does say that in this book that you know, as a kid, very early on, you got so used to like just maneuvering around drunken people because you were, like you said, you shared that space outside with everyone.
And I mean, my I brought up 2 kids in Vesterbro, and I remember once my mother, she was very concerned because they were drug addicts and so on, and she was afraid of if they would get influenced of all of this, and then my son said to her, well, you know, Granny, I mean, we are seeing what happens to these people. Do you really think that I mean, we would go and try that after seeing how they end up?
That's a good point. That's a good point.
But I mean, there have been things where I sort of have thought, okay, what's happening here? Once my son, he came back and told me that he and his friends had been playing at a local playground on their way to their sort of afternoon club, and then they had been running around in the bushes and they'd found a machine gun.
Oh, okay.
And then they had gone to the club and said, we found this, and they thought, yeah, we were just joking. And then these 3 boys, they went down to the local police station, so we found this machine gun. And the police actually went with them, and it was true, they had found a machine gun.
Okay, well, yeah. And in Denmark, they don't have the same drills as we do here, where they try and teach kids never to touch a gun, but that's a different.
Well, they knew that they were not going to touch. I mean, they were so they were quite. I mean, I'm happy that they didn't think it's something to play with.
Yeah.
Because I mean, kids here are not used to seeing guns because guns are not a part of the Danish society.
Yeah, I know. And that's a whole different topic, and I would be happy
won't go
to
into that.
No, we won't go into that. Like I have a 5-year-old who picked up a gun here in America at some point, but that's a different thing. So I want to go back to your when you worked in 2014 to 2016, you were the head of the climate unit and in charge of the climate change adaptation program. And the city's ambitious plan to be the first carbon neutral capital of the world by 2025. I know you won't completely meet that goal. We'll get back to that. But could you talk a little bit about the thinking behind like the physical environment, the social environment, and the economic environment? You talked a little bit about the socioeconomic earlier on in our conversation. That would be lovely if you could talk a little bit about those 3 aspects. I mean,
I can start with what I worked with the longest, because also before 2014, I was working with our work on adaptation, which is about how can we prepare the city for climate change, both when it comes to future storm surges and heavy rains, which we call cloudbursts. And the whole idea of that is also, again, building on the livability, to create a system that can manage the water, but can also add to the qualities of life of the city, so that we are making new green spaces that can manage water, but that the 95% or 99% of the time where they're not being used for stormwater management, they can actually be used for recreational purposes from the city citizens. So that's a thing. As for storm surges, one of the measures that we are working on at the moment is building an artificial island from leftover soil from building projects that will also, it will work as a barrier, but it will also have homes for 35,000 people living there. It'll be finished in 2070, so I'll never see it finished. I'll be dead by then. But it's still a fantastic idea of how can you actually turn a problem, climate change, into an opportunity to create a better city. And that's the sort of the whole concept about our adaptation work. When it comes to the climate action, I mean, about becoming carbon neutral, it's a different story. It has been, we are in the fortunate situation here that we, I think 99% of the Copenhageners are connected to our district heating system. And since we own the power plants that are supplying the Copenhageners, we've been able to push them to change from fossil fuels to biomass and other fuels that are non-fossil fuel based. They're also building wind turbines, both in Copenhagen and outside Copenhagen, also increasing our use of transition to green energy. Actually, now we have days, I think like today, where it's quite windy in Denmark, that we will be 100% of our electricity will come from wind. And sometimes we even produce more than we use, and then we export it to Germany. So it's or Sweden or Norway. So it's actually something that is so that's one thing. So the idea of the climate action plan was actually to say, can we make a transition where the city becomes carbon neutral? It's not me who becomes carbon neutral. That's a next step we will be taking. But not just me, but the general citizen of Copenhagen. But it's about the city. It's about what we produce and use of energy, not just a city, but also the citizens, what we produce and use of energy. Can we make that carbon neutral without making it an economic burden to people? Because, I mean, if you have to find support for energy measures, you have to be able to show that it's not about reducing quality of life. I mean, the district heating I have, I couldn't care less. I mean, the heat is the same whether it comes from biomass or from fossil fuels. Yeah. My conscience is a little better because I know it's coming from biomass or an incineration of waste, but not from fossil fuels. Yeah. But and it's the same. I mean, one of our big troubles here has been on mobility, because even though Copenhagen is a city of cyclists, we are also lots of Copenhageners who love their cars. And since Copenhageners have become increasingly wealthy, we have an increase in car ownership in the city. We have an increase in people from suburbs who are commuting to the city. It's interesting that the number of people commuting inside the city by car has gone down, but the number of people who are commuting into the city has gone up. Huh. So we have a lot of people who take their car to go to work in the city every day. And the number of Copenhageners who use their car for commuting inside the city has definitely gone down. And the number of people biking has gone up.
Does that say something about the infrastructure in terms of public transportation?
No, it says actually more about the infrastructure when it comes to biking. Okay. The fact that you've got, I can't remember, 600 kilometers of bike lanes in Copenhagen. That whenever you are doing new developments, bike infrastructure is part of that. We have built, I can't remember, 4 or 5 bridges that are crossing the harbor for pedestrians and bikes alone, making it so much easier to go from one part of the city to another. Yeah. And by prioritizing bikes, you make bikes the easy choice. If you ask Copenhageners, and we do that at regular intervals, why do you bike? Mm-hmm. And environment and climate is at the bottom of the list, not on the top. Yeah. Because it's not about saving the planet. It's the arguments are it's the easiest and fastest way to get around in the city.
It's convenient. So I was thinking about why people are taking the car from outside the city and in, and if that has something to do with public transportation and that infrastructure.
Yeah, I think, but it is also again about a general increase in wealth. Yeah. You can see that there's a decline in the use of the transportation during COVID. But you can unfortunately also see that there's a huge decline in the use of public transportation during COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And it is proving a little bit difficult to get people back in that once they've gotten used to taking the car, which they did for safety reasons. They are now in a situation where they perhaps should be getting back into the. So that's a big thing that we need to figure out. We had hoped that we would have some kind of congestion charges, but it's not something the city can decide itself. It's a national decision whether we can do that. So and so far we haven't had a political majority who had the courage to take such an unpopular decision of allowing us to have congestion charges, because that would definitely make a huge impact on how we are people will be transporting. So, I mean, we are regulating by the number of parking spaces we got. We are regulating by the prices for parking spaces and so on, and also sort of at sort of making it a little more difficult to go around by car in the city.
Yeah, and hopefully, I mean, hopefully this will happen. And the way things are going with the economy in Europe right now, maybe it won't be a political decision, but a private decision with people's wallets, right?
We can see in Denmark that there's a decline in our the number of commutes people are taking because of prices.
Yeah.
Car sharing, I mean, co-driving has become much more popular.
Yeah.
And what is also really astonishing, speed is being reduced, because, I mean, if you drive very fast in your car, it uses up much more gas than if you are driving at a lower speed. So you can actually see, I mean, all kinds of safety advice and so on, reduce speeding and so on. Yeah, you need just to raise.
Well, I hope it happens. I remember living in Copenhagen with 2 small kids and being quite frustrated about all the commuters coming in and polluting my city. So
yeah, but it's absolutely true. We have been granted the possibility to also reduce speed on some of the main roads in Copenhagen, which will also hopefully again make it less attractive, but also reduce noise and things like that. Because, I mean, not only do cars pollute, they're dangerous, but they also make noise. And in some areas we have a lot of noise here. Yeah. And there's still the idea that with businesses that cars bring business. So if you cannot have cars in the city, your business will go bankrupt if you're a shop or something like that. But our neighboring municipality, Frederiksberg, they did a survey a couple of years ago on one of the main shopping streets there. You probably know it, Gammel Kongevej. Yeah. And looked at what kind of trade came from cars and what kind of trade came from bikes. And the people on bikes, they bought less every time, but they bought more overall because they just made more stops. It's
whatever can fit on the bike as opposed to
I mean,
front, right?
I mean, you don't go out and buy a new bed or sofa and something like that on your bike, but you can do a lot of shopping on your bike, and it's easy for you to stop. Oh, here's an interesting shop, I'll go in and have a look there. You don't do that in your car. Then you go there because you want to go to this shop and you find a parking space near that. You go into that shop and then you continue afterwards.
That makes sense. So let's move towards a little more global perspective, because like I started out saying, you're not only working to better Copenhagen as a city, but also other cities. When you're sharing Copenhagen's climate results with other cities around the world, do you have any experience with like And have you visited American cities and shared some of your knowledge?
Yeah, I'm beginning to see the United States as my second home. I have a lot of collaboration in the States. I have since, well, not just me, the city has, but I've been the one driving it since 2015, had a collaboration agreement with New York City, where we are looking into the impacts of climate change and how to build resilience in the cities, mainly looking at stormwater management based on our cloudburst plan here in Copenhagen. We just renewed it a couple of weeks ago, and I was in New York 2 weeks ago also for during the United Nations General Assembly there. So I mean, I come to New York several times a year, but also we are working with DC, we work with Boston, and we're working with Houston. And just this morning, I had a meeting with Austin in Texas. So we have a lot of collaboration with US cities on our different types of results. We have an enormous amount of delegations coming to Copenhagen, also from US cities, to see and to hear about specific things, whether it be biking infrastructure, or it be energy and so on, to see how we are dealing with that, either on a Danish concept or just on a Copenhagen note. And then in 2015, I was so lucky that I had a German Marshall Foundation fellowship that allowed me to spend 5 weeks in the States. I was in 4 cities, Seattle, Portland, Philadelphia, and New York.
Okay, you covered both coasts.
I covered both coasts, looking at how they were working both on the climate action, but mainly on their adaptation work. And also to get an understanding of how is it organized, and get an understanding of the legislative system, because that's very different from Denmark, how it's funded, very different from Denmark. So I could better get an understanding of how does this work, and also how are the different cities integrating it into their overall policy. And so far what I found is that it's really hard for many cities to go to that point where it's not just about let's look at carbon emissions, or let's look at climate change adaptation, but it's done over here, and then the rest of the city development or urban development is going on over there. And sort of the integration becomes difficult. It's not impossible, and it is happening. New York has done some amazing work in the last years, but it's still really difficult to actually get it integrating. And part of that is because of the way things are funded and the difficulties in doing that.
Are you talking about like how the public sphere and the private sphere is?
Yeah, but also
working?
because of a lot of the measures that, for instance, they're doing in New York, they're funded by either FEMA or the HOT program. So it's federal money that they need coming in for it. It's very difficult, I mean, to have like a tax budget in Houston. You don't, landowners don't pay property tax. So, I mean, the tax base for using money for some of these things is really difficult.
Yeah.
And very often the money from FEMA or HOT, they come with a label on it. This must be used for that. So it's difficult to use them for things that go beyond that and have a more holistic, more integrated approach.
That's very interesting. Like,
so it tends to become really sector-based. I mean, not that we have lots of issues also with sector-based policies in Denmark. So it's not like we are fantastic at every step of the way, but it's really become, for me, one of the things that's really important to say. I was at a meeting in Philadelphia once where we met with the Army Corps of Engineers. I don't know if you know them. They are a federal company, I guess you would say, dealing with infrastructure matters. For instance, after the Hurricane Katrina, they built a storm surge wall in New Orleans. They have built some of the measures after Sandy in New York.
Yeah.
So, but they are engineers.
Okay.
And I was talking about how we were looking at total watersheds in Copenhagen when we did the planning. And they just said to me, yeah, well, I mean, we are only dealing with the rivers and streams. We don't deal with the inland flooding. And I said, where do you think the water runs? It runs into your system. Yeah, but that was not their issue. So maybe I said, maybe you should start talking to each other so that you could coordinate things. But it didn't seem like, I mean, they were dealing with two different budgets and two different sets of how to deal with things.
So the good intentions could be there, but because of the way the system is set up, it's really hard to get anything like cohesively done. Yeah,
I think that's my experience in some places, and then there are, of course, also, as I said, amazing work being done. Portland and Philadelphia, they've done some fantastic work with surface managing of stormwater. Philadelphia has a fantastic plan called Clean Water, Green City, or it's Green City, Clean Water, but it's a fantastic plan. Yeah. And the interesting thing of that is that they have found what they did was also a little bit something that we also work with based on economic shortages. They said it's so expensive to build underground infrastructure. Isn't there a smarter way we can stop combined sewer overflows? Couldn't we do it by creating some green infrastructure that can manage some of the water so it doesn't go into the sewers, so we don't have the overflows? And I think that, I mean, a lot of that inspired us in Copenhagen when we did our work. We took it one step further and said we will also be looking at the increase in rain we have due to climate change. So it's.
I was wondering about that because, like, I wanted to ask you what if anything you had learned from America, but I remember that being a huge story on the news, like moving the thinking to the surface. Where do we lead the water on the surface instead of having it go underground? I remember that was a huge thing on the news.
And that's very much the whole concept of our planning in Copenhagen, and which is something, a lot of that was inspired by also some of the things, especially Philadelphia and Portland. They are dealing with smaller rain events than we are, which is why ours and ours is a sort of connected citywide system. So we're basically creating a new infrastructure. So ours is that we're taking it one step further, but it's still based. And I think that's the interesting thing about learning from other cities, is that you take something, you translate it into your own context and make it your own. And all of a sudden you have some cities coming to you and asking, can we look at what you've done, and so on.
That's a beautiful thing about exchanging ideas at so many different levels, right? So I want to.
We've had that also when it comes to our idea of becoming carbon neutral, because a lot of people said, I mean, what's the difference? What happened? I mean, you cannot even see it on a global scale in Copenhagen, tiny city with less than 1 million inhabitants. How, I mean, why do that? And our reply has always been, because we want to demonstrate that it's possible without losing economic power, without losing a quality of life for the citizens, so that we can inspire other cities, also larger than Copenhagen, to do the same thing.
Amazing. So if you were to put on your hat that says my dream, what would your ideal, resilient and sustainable city look like? What does that look like to you?
I think it's a city that is much greener than what we see today. I think greening the city, bringing nature, I mean, not as sort of in wild prairies and woods and so on into the city, but still having a larger area, green, higher tree cover. When I think of Berlin, for example, it has a wonderful tree cover in the streets. And I would love to see more like that in Copenhagen or in any city. I would like to see a city where cars do not dominate so much as they do. If you look at the streets, it's still, even though we have this strong bike infrastructure, it's still a hugely car-dominated urban space that you've got in many places of the city. So making this much, having a public infrastructure for public transportation and bikes and car sharing and so on that can reduce the amount of traffic in the city, I think that would also be ideal for me, so that you would actually have that. And then I would like the city also to be able to remain diverse. Because if I have to say one thing that I'm finding a little bit problematic at the moment is that because Copenhagen has become what it has also become hugely popular, meaning that real estate prices have gone up. I mean, we're nowhere near some of the big cities in the US, but it's still, so it's difficult for ordinary families, for young people to buy a home here. And that's why it's really difficult to manage sort of making sure that we still have a diverse city in the future. So having that affordable housing, I don't know how to do it, but it would be really great to be able to have that.
Yeah, well.
So that's sort of my ideal city. The idea, and I mean, I've taken many US delegations biking in Copenhagen, and they've always said, I wish I lived here, when they saw a father coming on a cargo bike with two kids in them in the cargo bike and on the way somewhere, or a mother with a child on a seat behind her and on her bike. Because that kind of security on the bike lanes is really important to have sort of my ideal city, to be able to have that sort of flow. There's nothing like biking through Copenhagen on a summer evening.
That is true. Oh, I think that's such a perfect ending to this interview, unless you have anything you would like to add.
No, I'm fine with this. So it's perfect.
Well, thank you. It's been such a privilege talking to you. I'm so happy you took the time, and I'm sure that viewers will appreciate it too. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And to our viewers, before we end, I would like to take a moment to thank the Scandesign Foundation, Museum of Danish America, Northwest Danish Association, National Foundation for Danish America, National Nordic Museum, American-Scandinavian Foundation, University of Wisconsin, Madison, and the University of Washington Scandinavian Studies Department. If anyone heard some clicking sound, it's my dog. I apologize for that. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next time.